Our second article will be presented by Sven Molner from the University of London, Jaideep Prabhu from the University of Cambridge, and Manjit Yadav from Texas A&M University. It examines the interesting topic of developing a theory to assist managers or developers of early-stage technologies in more effectively identifying a market space for their technology. I'll turn it over to you all now. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present our paper, Lost in the Universe of Markets, and welcome everybody who's joining us today. So it's a joint project with Jaideep Prabhu from the University of Cambridge and Manjit Yadav from Texas A&M University, and I'm Sven Molner from University of London. And the idea for this project emerged after a conversation I had with a technology transfer manager from a prestigious research university. And we talked about his job, and he explained to me how difficult it can be to find the right markets for early-stage technologies that emerge from the science labs at his university, and how frequently such projects fail. And he also jokingly said that marketers would probably suggest that this shouldn't be done in the first place because these technologies are not linked directly to any market needs. And I was fascinated. It made me realize that the marketing literature has a lot to say about market pull innovations when the process begins with market needs and customer needs. But there's quite a gap in our knowledge when it comes to technology push innovations that are not based on market needs, but are rather driven by scientific curiosity and technological ingenuity. So our paper focuses on this fundamental and largely overlooked marketing challenge. So for early stage technologies that are born in science labs at universities and also tech companies, relevant market spaces, relevant application areas are often entirely unclear. So we aim to understand how managers, entrepreneurs, and inventors make decisions about market spaces when they are facing significant market ambiguity, and especially how they make effective market space decisions. So in other words, our research was driven by the question, how do managers, entrepreneurs, and inventors identify the right market spaces for their early stage technologies? Now, it's quite well acknowledged that early stage technologies have to pass through what is called the valley of death. So that means that after they are discovered and developed in science labs, they have to attract follow-on investment to be developed into a commercialized new product, or otherwise funding may dry up and they will remain commercially unexploited and don't create any value. Now, this is particularly challenging for early-stage technologies that emerge from university labs that have to attract external investment from the private sector. So to achieve this, technology transfer managers at universities, together with university inventors, have to demonstrate that an early-stage technology has commercial potential, that there is a potential market for the technology. Which brings us to our focal marketing challenge, which I would like to illustrate with the following example. So recently, researchers at Harvard University have developed nanostructure meta-lenses that can focus the entire visible spectrum of light with extremely high resolution. And these meta-lenses could replace conventional curved lenses in all kinds of devices, making devices potentially much smaller in size and better in terms of image resolution. Therefore, the potential market applications could include smartphones, virtual reality applications, microscopes, and cameras. However, it's entirely unclear if and how, from a technical perspective, meta-lenses could be implemented in such devices, if products developed using meta-lenses will be profitable, if there are other potential market applications that the researchers are unaware of. That is what we call market ambiguity. So market ambiguity refers to the uncertainty regarding the nature, the number, and the commercial viability of potential market applications. So market scoping is the marketing activity that directly tackles market ambiguity. And market scoping, as we define it, refers to the managerial activities directed at the identification of the market space for a focal early-stage technology. So to develop a theoretical understanding of how technology transfer managers and university inventors carry out market scoping activities, we conducted an in-depth, qualitative, multiple case study of technology commercialization projects carried out at a global research university. And we were provided with archival data and email records for the focal technology projects. And these offered a unique window into market scoping efforts of project teams. And these project teams typically involve 2 technology transfer managers and the inventors. So project teams are the unit of analysis of our research. And our access to email records, email interactions between team members and external individuals such as investors, company representatives, and consultants provide us with a very rich and unbiased picture of the undertaken market scoping activities. And in total, we examined 6 high-profile technology projects from different technology backgrounds and with different market scoping outcomes, including both successes and failures. Now, a key finding that emerged from our research is that teams can adopt very different market scoping mindsets. And these mindsets then shape subsequent market-based decisions and outcomes. On the one hand, teams may avoid market ambiguity, and we refer to this mindset as market ambiguity avoidance. This means that they prefer early market space clarity. They try to establish upfront, early on, what the desired market space is. On the other hand, teams may accept market ambiguity, and we refer to this mindset as market ambiguity acceptance. That means that teams avoid preconceptions about the potential market space and prefer to discover the market space gradually over time. And these 2 different market scoping mindsets lead to very different market space decision patterns, and we're going to explore these next. So let's have a closer look at how market ambiguity avoidance shapes market space decisions. So remember that market ambiguity avoidance means that teams prefer early market space clarity. They seek to clarify early on what the desired market space is. So first, to develop an initial sense of orientation in an ambiguous market environment, teams try to identify potential end-use situations for the technology. So in the case of a new material with unique stretch properties, for example, the team identified use situations in the healthcare industry, automotive industry, and fashion industry. The teams then reach out to potential end users or manufacturers of end user products and conduct in-depth interviews to clarify potential end user benefits and assess the general attractiveness of the identified end use scenarios. And we call these behaviors downstream market space anchoring, as they reflect a strong downstream orientation of teams toward end use situations and end users. Now, for these identified market space options suggested by end use situations, the teams then deepen their interactions with downstream industry players to assess the technical feasibility of the market space options. So based on technical requirements and performance expectations articulated by end users or manufacturers of end user products, the inventors develop technology samples and technology prototypes for technology testing. So through this technology testing, the teams learn about which of the identified market space options are actually technically feasible and which options are not technically feasible and should be abandoned. And we call these behaviors confirmatory market space substantiation, and they help teams to narrow down the potential market space. Now finally, for the remaining technically feasible market space options, teams try to negotiate favorable terms in commercialization agreements with their collaborators. Specifically, they try to establish tightly defined application areas in commercial agreements that are focused on specific, well-defined end-use situations. So these application areas, which are typically called fields of use, define for which market spaces a company, a collaborator, will carry out technology and product development. So for example, in the case of the new material with unique stretch properties, the team negotiated with a healthcare company and try to focus the application area on compression stockings. So by establishing such end-use specific application areas with several companies, teams aim to ensure that technology is adopted as widely as possible and developed to its full potential. And we call these behaviors closed-ended market space claiming. Now, when teams adopt market ambiguity acceptance, market space decisions look very differently. Remember that market ambiguity acceptance means that teams avoid market space preconceptions, and they prefer to discover the market space gradually over time. So in the case of a new membrane technology that offers improved nanoporosity, rather than looking downstream at end-use scenarios, such as, for instance, wastewater treatment or water desalination, The team aims to identify similar technologies in order to carry out technology benchmarking. The team tries to get a better sense of the contribution the technology could make to the current technological state of the art in the membrane area. So rather than initiating downstream interactions, teams establish relationships with upstream technology developers. We therefore call these behaviors upstream market space anchoring, as they reflect a team's orientation towards upstream technology regimes and upstream developers. So next, teams leverage the technology assets of upstream collaborators, such as their R&D facilities, their equipment, and their technical know-how to explore the focal technology's capabilities. They're trying to understand what the technology is really good at. So only once these technology capabilities are better understood, the teams try to clarify which downstream markets might benefit the most from these capabilities. And we call these behaviors exploratory market space substantiation, as they open up the potential market space. And finally, rather than negotiating tightly defined and end-use specific application areas with collaborators, the teams aim to establish areas in commercial agreements that are focused on technology features and capabilities. So such application areas then transcend specific end-use situations, and they therefore allow teams to establish an extendable rather than a well-defined market space. And we call these behaviors open-ended market space claiming. Now, what is the impact of the different market scoping mindsets and resulting market space decisions on market scoping outcomes? Now, while market ambiguity avoidance, with its downstream orientation and the strong focus on end-use scenarios and end users, resonates very closely with traditional marketing thinking, we found that this mindset may actually lead to unwanted outcomes. And this is because market ambiguity avoidance is based on premature ideas about the desirable end-use situations, while early-stage technologies are not ready for the harsh downstream market realities, where companies seek often quick performance improvements in their market operations. And early-stage technologies are very vulnerable to inflated performance expectations due to their low maturity. So in contrast, market ambiguity acceptance is much more likely to lead to productive collaborations with upstream partners who possess suitable technology assets which help cultivate our technology's capabilities first before making any decisions about downstream markets. Therefore, market ambiguity acceptance is much more likely to lead to favorable market scoping outcomes. Now, you may wonder why teams do not simply change their market scoping mindset in response to negative market information when their market scoping efforts fail. Now, we found that teams respond very differently to negative market feedback, and the way teams involve external consultants plays an important role. So on the one hand, teams may establish close and formalized relationships with external consultants who offer expertise in certain market domains. So the consultants become de facto team members and have a strong influence on the project. And they often reinforce the initial market scoping mindset of team members when negative market feedback is received. So they do this to safeguard their own market-specific interests. Then failed market scoping efforts are often attributed to external circumstances, such as bad timing or the market was not ready. So the team essentially blames the market for their failure. So the fact that consultants reinforce the initial market scoping mindset leads to team conformity, and the end result is often mindset entrenchment. Now, on the other hand, teams may involve consultants in technology projects very differently. They may involve them on a more flexible and ad hoc basis to address a specific problem at hand. So, for example, teams may hire a consultant to conduct market research into an interesting market domain. So given that consultants, under these circumstances, have no stake in the project itself and don't need to safeguard their market-specific interests, they're more likely to present teams with new and challenging insights and perspectives, which stimulates internal debate within team, disagreement, and even conflict. And teams are then able to reconsider their initial market scoping mindset. So therefore, this form of involving consultants on a more flexible and ad hoc basis is more likely to facilitate mindset shifts if these are needed. So to summarize, we would like to make the following recommendations for managers, inventors, and entrepreneurs who are involved in early-stage technology commercialization. And these recommendations are to kind of challenge existing or long-held marketing beliefs. And first, practitioners are encouraged to look upstream, not just downstream. That's because upstream industry entities, such as upstream developers, offer more important technological inputs. Second, focus on the technology's evolution, not just its immediate user benefits. Prioritize the technology needs rather than market needs. Third, be agnostic, not dogmatic about the market space. Try to avoid tight control over the market space and give upstream collaborators greater market space freedom. And fourth, don't blame the market for failure. Allow internal debate and even conflict about market space preferences to facilitate mindset shifts if these are needed. So we would like to leave you with this picture, which kind of reflects a new way of thinking about markets. So during this project, market spaces for early stage technologies made me think about river deltas, which may sound a bit odd, but think about it. So our research findings encourage practitioners to focus on upstream entry points where early stage technologies can leverage the strength of the current in order to spread out into different downstream markets gradually over time. So thank you very much for listening, and yeah, we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that very interesting presentation. We now have time, again, for questions from our participants. If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and type it in the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen, not the studio chat tab, and we will have the presenters answer in real time. And we have one coming in. Were the teams generally uniform in their makeup? I'm wondering if interdisciplinary teams might be more likely to have one mindset versus a team of researchers who come from similar research backgrounds. Good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we try to keep that constant. So the makeup of the team was always 2 technology transfer managers, and there was a senior technology transfer manager and more like a junior technology transfer manager, and they both had an expertise in the technology domain, and of course the inventors. So overall, we can claim that the makeup of the different teams was similar, and but it's a good question, because if you think about it, the makeup of the team would be important. So if the team would be made up of different people with different mindsets, like if the technology managers, let's say, let's just hypothetically speaking, if one technology transfer manager has more like a marketing background, an MBA, for instance, in marketing, then this would lead to a different mindset, rather than if the technology transfer manager has a scientific background and has a science PhD. That would also lead, I believe, that's just hypothetically speaking, that would lead to the manager having a different mindset. And so that's kind of relates to a question, what drives the mindset of the managers. And we believe that prior experience, of course, is important. Prior experience and prior educational background is important, and these aspects drive the mindset that managers may have. But in our case, the managers were quite similar, so they all had a more like science background, and that's why we can claim that in our research, the makeup of the teams was very similar. But in future research, we could look at other teams that are more diverse, and it would be interesting to see how that impacts the market scoping mindset.
Actually, I wonder if I could just add to that page. This is Jaideep Prabhu, the co-author.
Sure.
So anecdotally, I've been supervising projects that are conducted by postdocs and researchers in the university where I teach, which consists of these interdisciplinary teams. And in particular, I'm thinking of one I'm supervising at the moment where the inventor has come up with a technology that uses electrons from the roots of plants to generate a very low power circuit, which can then drive an Internet of Things assembly. So it's very interesting. They're looking at how they would commercialize something like this. And of course, you could think of several possible market applications. But the team is interdisciplinary. You have some people who are closer to the technology, some people who are closer to the plant science, and then there are some people who are more on the business side. And in that team, you do see these kinds of differences in mindset that Patrick was asking about. You see those who have more of a business background and more of a consumer research background, thinking about the farmers and what types of farmers, what kinds of segments there might be out there that might use this. Those who are on the plant science side are thinking about, how you might collect data that improves the productivity of the plant and on the agricultural side. And then, of course, the people who are more on the chemistry side are thinking about how you would improve the scientific, the generation of electricity. So I think it's a great question, and it would be very interesting to do future research where we are able to look at such interdisciplinary teams to see how that affects the mindset.
Great. And building off of that question, so you were just talking about the team's composition. Do you think that mindsets vary according to the industries they're trying to launch into?
You mean the mindset that the collaborators have?
Yes.
The industry collaborators?
Yes. The mindset of the team and what their target market space they think they're going into. Is there some relationship there?
Yeah, so the mindset of the team typically is initially is quite uniform. So they normally agree on something to start with, and typically the inventor, the researchers drive this initially, and the technology transfer manager kind of follows the mindset that the researchers have, and then it really depends also who they then talk to in the industry. So often this mindset then also shapes who they are then talking to in the industry. So if they have this market ambiguity, avoidance mindset, they talk to people in a downstream setting, to end users, and that of course then reinforces their own mindset, and because the downstream people, the people in a downstream industry context, of end users or manufacturers of end user products, they also of course have that mindset, a similar mindset, and they want to see quick performance improvements for in a certain end use situation, and so the mindset of the team clearly impacts which people they talk to in the industry. But it would be also still interesting to see in the future, which we couldn't look at into much detail, how the mindsets of the collaborators, because we have seen in our research that these are quite similar then to the mindset of the teams. But if the teams then in a downstream context maybe meet a mindset that is slightly different, how that impacts the overall mindset of the team, what kind of feedback effects might be observable. So far what we have seen in our research is that teams with a certain mindset, whether that's market ambiguity avoidance or acceptance, talk to people in the industry that have very similar mindsets. But there might be situations where they talk to people in the industry that have a very different mindset, and it would be interesting to see how that impacts, what kind of feedback effects we might be observable in that context.
Right.
I mean, maybe if I could jump in on that point, Paige. I think there are also broad sectoral differences. So, for instance, we were told by some of the senior managers that there's a big difference between if they're looking at commercializing breakthroughs in the life sciences versus the physical sciences.
Right.
So in the physical sciences, typical breakthroughs are like the sorts of materials, these examples that Sven gave in his talk. When the life sciences, the breakthroughs are often new molecules which could make their way into a new drug that could treat a disease, in a new therapeutic area. And typically, interestingly, in the life sciences, the routes to market are pretty well known. If it's a new molecule, then typically you're looking for a big pharma company to then do the clinical trials and take it through the regulatory process. And so there are these big sectoral differences in terms of whether you would, be more, whether what we found is likely to hold or not.
Interesting. Great, thank you. I have another question coming in. You have focused your research on the context of university tech transfer. To what extent do you think your findings can also be applied in corporate settings? For example, market ambiguity avoidance tends to have negative outcomes. Do you also believe this is true in corporate settings?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, of course, the university setting is very different from our corporate setting, and the university setting, less resources are available for technology development, whereas a corporate setting has much more resources available for technology development. So, again, we would need to do further research into that, and hopefully our paper will and our research will stimulate future research in this area in the corporate context. But I think that the negative consequences of market ambiguity avoidance may be less severe. So because companies may invest more resources into the technology development to de-risk the technology and to make it more attractive to downstream companies, to downstream end users, even though they have a market ambiguity avoidance mindset. So the negative consequences of market ambiguity avoidance might be less severe, but I still believe that market ambiguity acceptance would overall improve the performance of market scoping efforts in the corporate setting, because this mindset would help them to be more open-minded and explore the technology capabilities in a broader fashion and see more potential linkages to different markets. So I think applying, maybe it would be even better in a corporate setting, because applying a market ambiguity acceptance mindset, because often they are very biased towards their own market operations, and they may not see what other opportunities are outside their market operations. So I think market ambiguity acceptance would be really beneficial also in a corporate setting, whereas market ambiguity avoidance, maybe the negative consequences might be less severe. That's my intuition. Of course, future research is needed to show what is really happening. Jaideep, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a great answer. In fact, I mean, you might think that because they are commercially minded, they might tend to look downstream, but it could also be the case that they will look for commercial opportunities in wherever they are, whether they are upstream or downstream. And again, maybe depending on the ethos of the company, they could be more sort of B2B, more on the upstream end, and therefore actually have a market ambiguity sort of acceptance mindset. But anyway, I think it would be very interesting to follow up with a study of a company.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So here's one. How would you suggest that companies try to work with these kinds of research teams? Should companies try to look for a particular mindset? I think you've addressed a little bit of that second part of the question, but how do you suggest that companies try to work with these kinds of research teams?
Yeah, I mean, of course, our research findings kind of have implications also for the broader industry, and I think, in the industry, if you look at the incentives in the industry, many companies, they look for quick performance improvements. So I think many companies, especially those who in a more downstream context, would have to change their mindset, be more patient, and I think there's like a different logic that guides corporate settings compared to university settings. So the expectations with regards to, normally companies have very strict expectations with regards to performance expectations and IP requirements and so forth. And I think companies should be more open-minded, and it requires a change of thinking if they wish to work with research teams with such early-stage technologies. And I think they would benefit from that, but they need to give them more time and be open-minded about what the technology can do, and then not to be overly obsessed with their own market operations, but maybe these technologies and these research teams from a university setting may help them explore an entirely new market domain and therefore secure future growth options. So I think, many companies may have to, especially in downstream contexts, may have to change their way of thinking and when they start working with these research teams. And of course, in an upstream context, this might be less severe. So here, companies are open-minded anyway, and they are experimental with regards to, from an experimental mindset with regards to new technologies. So here, it might be easier.
Just as a quick follow-on to that, what can these firms do to manage their mindsets and shift their mindsets more proactively?
That's a good question. I mean, it would require internal incentives to allow for more experimental mindset among managers, to give them space or freedom to fail and to enter into risky projects. So it's like a cultural thing, I would say. That would mean a cultural change that would be required in many companies, not in all companies. So it depends on the already existing culture. If the already existing culture is already designed in a way that the company encourages managers, R&D managers, product managers to be exploratory and to try on new technologies, outside technologies, and that's great. But in other companies are more conservative, and so it's really a cultural question. And some companies have the right culture that fits with a market ambiguity acceptance mindset, whereas other companies may have to change their internal culture so that managers are encouraged and incentivized to allow a market ambiguity acceptance mindset. Jaideep, do you have any?
I would just add that a general openness to alternative viewpoints. I think having interdisciplinary teams can help. Not having uniform teams, not hiring the same types of consultants in a very formal way, as we pointed out, that can help. I think also a certain amount of tolerance for experimentation, a tolerance for debate, being aware, not sort of falling into groupthink. So anything that can encourage experimentation, multiple viewpoints, routine sort of questioning of assumptions, reviewing options. I think all that kind of practice could encourage this a good approach to commercializing early stage technology.
Yeah, and also a job rotation maybe within teams, so that teams are exposed to different perspectives. So what we saw in our research is that many teams, what I mentioned under mindset entrenchment, that they develop this conformity inside the team, that they kind of develop similar viewpoints, and that can happen quite often. And so job rotation might be one way to alleviate that risk, that this mindset entrenchment happens.
Great. Well, thank you both for a very interesting presentation and a really interesting Q&A session.